"Don't sign the will," the maid's toddler screamed at the funeral. Moments later, everything changed. Nobody expected a 4-year-old's scream to stop a funeral. The Sterling family chapel was silent except for the soft organ music and the rustle of black silk. 200 mourners sat in perfect rows, heads bowed, mourning a man who had built one of the largest fortunes in the country. At the front, beside the casket of Richard Sterling, his son Alexander stood holding a pen, ready to sign the document the family lawyer had just placed in front of him, a document everyone believed was simply a formality. Then a small voice shattered the silence. "Don't sign the will." Every head turned. A little boy in a clip-on tie had broken free from his mother's hand and was running down the center aisle, clutching a worn, faded toy robot to his chest. His small face red with desperate urgency. "Noah!" his mother gasped, rushing after him, mortified, reaching for her son in front of the entire grieving crowd. But Alexander Sterling did not move to sign. He stood frozen, pen hovering above the paper, staring down at the maid's son, a child he barely knew, as something cold and unexplainable settled in his chest. Behind him, Vanessa Hart's perfectly composed face flickered, just for an instant, with something that looked very much like panic. The family lawyer, Daniel Cross, cleared his throat too quickly. "Alexander, perhaps we should step outside. This isn't the place." "Why not?" Alexander asked quietly, his eyes still fixed on the toy robot clutched in Noah's small arms. A toy his late father had given the boy himself months ago, for reasons no one had ever explained. What none of them knew yet was that the answer to that question, the real answer, was hidden inside that very toy. And in the next 20 minutes, it would expose a betrayal that had been carefully planned for over a year. Welcome, friend. If a story has ever made you gasp out loud, made you cry without warning, made you want to reach through the screen and hug a child you've never met, you're in the right place. Today's story is about a hard-working single mother, her fearless little boy, and a billionaire who never imagined that the truth about his father's final wishes was hidden inside a child's broken toy. It's a story about greed dressed up in designer suits, about a grandfather's quiet love reaching beyond the grave, and about a 4-year-old brave enough to scream the truth when every adult around him stayed silent. Stay until the end, because the final twist will completely change how you see everyone in this story. Let's begin. Maria Lopez was 29 years old and had been raising her son alone since before he could walk. Noah's father had left when Maria was 4 months pregnant, disappearing with a half-packed suitcase and a text message that simply said he wasn't ready. Maria never chased him for support. She was too proud, and too exhausted from working double shifts at a diner to spend energy on a man who had already made his choice clear. She found the housekeeping position at the Sterling estate through a cousin who cleaned offices for the company. It paid better than anything she'd had before, came with modest staff housing on the property, and, most importantly to Maria, it meant Noah could grow up somewhere safe, with a yard to run in and rooms that didn't have water stains on the ceiling. She worked harder than anyone on staff. She memorized which rooms Richard Sterling preferred warmer, which flowers Eleanor liked replaced weekly, which days the kitchen needed extra coffee for early board calls. She never complained, never gossiped, never asked for anything beyond her wages. What the other staff didn't fully understand was how much it cost her, every single day, to maintain that quiet dignity. Maria had grown up in a small apartment with a mother who cleaned houses just like this one, and she had promised herself as a teenager that her own children would never feel the particular shame of being looked through by people who paid your salary. She kept that promise fiercely. When wealthy guests at the estate occasionally mistook her for invisible, speaking over her or around her as though she weren't in the room, Maria simply did her work and went home to Noah, where she became, instantly, the most important person in the world to someone. Richard Sterling had been the rare exception among the family. In his final year, weakened by illness, he had taken an unusual liking to Maria's quiet competence and even quieter kindness. He often asked her to bring Noah along during her afternoon shifts, claiming the boy's laughter made the house feel less like a mausoleum. Maria hadn't questioned it much at the time. She simply appreciated that someone in that enormous, cold house seemed to genuinely enjoy her son's company, and had no idea that those quiet afternoons would one day matter more than anyone could have imagined. 3 weeks before his death, Richard had handed Noah an old toy robot from his own study, worn and slightly dented, insisting the boy keep it safe. "Promise me you won't lose this one, little man," he'd said, with a strange seriousness Maria remembered but didn't understand. She had no idea what that toy actually contained, or that it would soon shatter everything she thought she knew about her quiet, comfortable life at the Sterling estate. Noah Lopez was 4 years old, fearless, and utterly convinced that every adult around him was secretly hiding something fascinating. He had his mother's stubborn jaw and an unstoppable curiosity that had, on separate occasions, led him to take apart a kitchen radio, interview the estate's gardener for 45 minutes about worms, and attempt to teach the family's elderly golden retriever to high-five. He collected things obsessively: bottle caps, smooth pebbles, a single yellow marble he called Sunny, and refused to sleep without. But nothing compared to his attachment to the worn toy robot Richard Sterling had given him weeks before his death. Noah named it Captain Bolt. He carried it everywhere, to breakfast, into the bath, much to Maria's exasperation, even tucked under his pillow at night. He talked to it constantly, narrating his entire day in elaborate detail, completely unaware that the toy occasionally made the faintest clicking sound when he squeezed its chest, a detail he found delightful and never once questioned. He had an extraordinary memory for someone so small. He could recite, almost word for word, conversations he'd overheard days earlier, often blurting them out at spectacularly inconvenient moments, much to the quiet horror of the household staff and once an entire dinner party. What made Noah impossible not to love was his complete lack of social filter combined with an enormous, generous heart. He hugged the mailman. He cried when a beetle died on the patio and insisted on a funeral with full ceremony. He once gave his last cookie to a security guard who looked, in Noah's exact words, "Kind of sad today." Richard Sterling had adored him instantly. In his final months, weakened and increasingly isolated from a family circling his fortune like vultures, the old man found something restorative in Noah's unguarded honesty. "A rare thing," he often told Maria, "in a house full of people who only tell me what they think I want to hear." Noah had no concept of wills, inheritances, or fortunes. He understood simply that the kind old man with the silver hair had liked his stories and had given him a very special robot to keep safe. He had absolutely no idea that keeping it safe would one day mean standing in a chapel full of strangers, screaming at the top of his small lungs to stop a man he barely knew from signing a piece of paper. At 42, Alexander Sterling had everything money could buy and almost nothing it couldn't. He had taken over Sterling Holdings 8 years earlier, expanding his father's already substantial empire into technology, real estate, and global logistics. Business magazines praised his discipline. Competitors feared his negotiating instincts. Employees respected him, though few would describe him as warm. The truth, known to almost no one, was that Alexander had built his entire identity around proving himself worthy of his father's legacy, and had spent so many years chasing that approval that he'd forgotten how to simply exist without an agenda. His mother, Eleanor, had once gently suggested he take a vacation. He had laughed, genuinely confused by the concept, and scheduled 3 additional board meetings that same week. His relationship with Richard had been complicated, full of love neither men were particularly skilled at expressing. Richard had been proud of his son's success but worried in his final years that Alexander had inherited his own worst habit, mistaking constant motion for genuine living. When Richard's health began declining 18 months ago, Alexander threw himself into managing the company's transition with the same relentless focus he brought to everything, leaving little room to process the slow, painful reality of losing his father. He visited the estate when his schedule allowed, always arriving with his phone still in hand, always leaving sooner than he meant to. It was during this period that Vanessa Hart entered his life, introduced by mutual business associates at a fundraising gala, elegant and effortlessly charming in exactly the way Alexander, exhausted and grieving in advance, found easy to lean on. She never pushed him to talk about his father. She never asked uncomfortable questions. She simply made his evenings feel lighter, and after years of carrying everything alone, that ease felt to Alexander dangerously close to love. He proposed 8 months later. Richard, by then confined mostly to the estate, had met Vanessa only a handful of times before his death. Polite, watchful encounters that Alexander, in his grief and exhaustion, never thought to examine too closely. He had no idea his father's quiet, careful observations during those brief meetings had led the old man to a conclusion that would, after his death, blow Alexander's entire understanding of his fiancée wide open. Vanessa Hart was 34, flawlessly composed, and had spent the better part of a decade learning exactly how to make wealthy, lonely men feel understood. She came from a family with old social connections but increasingly thin finances, a background she discussed in vague, charming generalities and never in specifics. By the time she met Alexander Sterling, she had already developed a precise, practiced formula. Identify what a man was missing emotionally, supply exactly that, and become indispensable before he noticed he'd stopped asking questions. With Alexander, what he was missing was simple lightness. Someone who didn't need anything complicated from him. Vanessa gave him exactly that, while privately, patiently, assessing the full scope of what marrying into the Sterling fortune would actually mean. Richard Sterling had not been fooled for long. In their third meeting, over a quiet dinner Alexander had been called away from twice for urgent calls. Richard had asked Vanessa directly about her work, her family, her plans beyond the wedding. Vanessa answered smoothly, beautifully. And Richard, who had spent 50 years reading people across negotiating tables, recognized the practiced quality beneath the polish almost immediately. He said nothing to Alexander. Not yet. He wanted to be certain. What Richard didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Vanessa had already begun a separate, careful relationship of her own, with Daniel Cross, the Sterling family's longtime attorney, a man 58 years old with mounting personal debts from a costly divorce and an increasingly desperate eye toward retirement funds he didn't have. Vanessa had approached Daniel 11 months ago under the guise of planning ahead for the wedding, gradually steering conversations toward the structure of the Sterling family trust, the mechanics of inheritance law, and, eventually carefully, toward a quiet arrangement that would benefit them both enormously, should anything in Richard's will prove flexible, before the old man's declining health made such flexibility impossible. Daniel had hesitated at first. 30 years of loyal service stood between him and what Vanessa was suggesting. But desperation has a way of eroding loyalty, one quiet justification at a time. By the time Richard Sterling passed away peacefully in his sleep 8 weeks ago, Vanessa and Daniel had already taken the first careful steps toward making sure the version of his will that mattered, the real one, would never see daylight. The first incident happened during a family lunch, 3 months before Richard's death. Noah, excited about a drawing he'd made, ran into the dining room to show Alexander, accidentally bumping Vanessa's chair. She turned sharply, her smile tightening into something colder. "Someone needs to teach that child boundaries," she said, just loud enough for Maria, entering with a serving tray, to hear clearly. Maria said nothing, gathering Noah gently and retreating, her ears burning with quiet humiliation. The second incident involved a broken vase. Noah, chasing the family dog through a hallway, had knocked over an antique piece worth more than Maria's entire annual salary. Before Maria could even apologize, Vanessa demanded in front of several guests that the housekeeper's son be kept entirely out of the main house going forward. Richard, overhearing from his study, intervened immediately, gently but firmly overruling her, a moment Vanessa did not forget or forgive. The third incident was smaller but telling. Vanessa, organizing wedding seating arrangements, crossed Maria's name off a list of staff invited to a small holiday gathering Richard traditionally hosted for longtime employees, muttering to Daniel Cross that some traditions need updating. The fourth incident came directly from Daniel himself. Reviewing routine estate paperwork, he noticed Richard had quietly increased Maria's salary and added her to a minor company benefits program, a small, almost invisible gesture of gratitude. Daniel flagged it to Vanessa with visible irritation. "He's getting sentimental," he said. "That's exactly the kind of thing that gets messy if he keeps changing his mind about things." The fifth incident, weeks before Richard's death, planted the deepest unease. Eleanor Sterling, passing her husband's study late one evening, overheard him on the phone with someone from his personal attorney's office. Not Daniel Cross, but a different firm entirely, saying quietly, "I want this finalized before anything changes. And I want it kept completely confidential until I say otherwise." Eleanor didn't understand the context. But something about her husband's tone, urgent, careful, almost fearful, stayed with her long after she'd gone to bed. None of them yet understood how these small, scattered moments of coldness, suspicion, and quiet defiance were all converging toward the same hidden truth. A truth Richard Sterling had decided, in his final weeks, only one small, fearless child could be trusted to protect. 6 weeks before his death, Richard Sterling began behaving strangely, quietly, carefully, in ways only a handful of people noticed. He started spending long afternoons alone in his study with the door locked, instructing staff he was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. He made several phone calls from a private line Eleanor didn't recognize, always lowering his voice when anyone entered the room. Twice, a courier arrived from an unfamiliar law firm, requesting his signature on sealed envelopes that were never discussed with the family. Maria, bringing him tea one afternoon, found him examining Noah's old toy robot, the one the boy had momentarily left behind after an earlier visit, turning it carefully in his weathered hands with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This little fellow," he murmured almost to himself, "is about to become very important." Maria assumed he simply meant Noah was fond of it. She had no idea Richard had spent that entire afternoon with an electronic specialist he'd quietly hired from outside the company, a specialist sworn to confidentiality, who had carefully installed a small voice recorder inside the toy's chest cavity, accessible only by a hidden seam along its back panel. Meanwhile, Vanessa's suspicions were rising in a different direction. She'd noticed Daniel Cross growing increasingly anxious, snapping at her during their calls, mentioning more than once that Richard had been asking unusual questions lately about the existing will's exact wording. "He's questioning everything," Daniel told her tensely during a hushed phone call she took in the estate's garden, believing herself unobserved. "If he's drafting something new with an outside firm, everything we've arranged could fall apart completely." Vanessa, unbeknownst to her, was overheard during that very call. Not by Maria, not by Eleanor, but by Noah, playing nearby with Captain Bolt, who understood nothing of what he heard except that the lady sounded kind of mad, and that grown-ups, he'd noticed, often said important-sounding things in the garden when they thought no one was listening. He mentioned it to his mother that evening, in the scattered, half-remembered way young children report things. "Miss Vanessa was talking mad on the phone about Grandpa Richard's papers," he said, more interested in his dinner than the words themselves. Maria, exhausted from a long shift, told him gently that grown-up phone calls weren't anything to worry about and tucked him into bed. Neither of them yet understood that Noah had just overheard the exact conversation that would eventually expose everything, or that the answer to all of it was already sitting, quietly, inside the toy clutched against his chest. The discovery came from Eleanor Sterling, 3 days after her husband's funeral arrangements had been finalized, though the funeral itself was still a week away. Going through Richard's study to organize his personal effects, a task she'd been avoiding out of grief, Eleanor found a locked drawer she didn't recognize, tucked behind a panel in his desk that required a key she eventually located taped beneath the drawer above it. A small, careful precaution that told her, immediately, her husband had not wanted this found by accident. Inside was a single folder marked simply, "Final Instructions, Confidential." Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was correspondence with an outside law firm she'd never heard of, dated just 2 months before Richard's death, discussing, in formal legal language she only partially understood, the drafting of an amended will. References to concerns regarding undue influence, to protective provisions for loyal staff, and most alarmingly, to language explicitly revoking certain provisions in the will currently held by Daniel Cross's office. Eleanor sat frozen at her husband's desk, the folder trembling in her hands, a cold and specific dread settling over her. Richard had changed his will, quietly, deliberately, without telling Daniel Cross, the family's attorney of 30 years. Which meant the will Daniel currently held, the one scheduled to be formally read and signed off following the funeral, was not Richard's final wishes at all. Eleanor didn't know yet what had changed or why, or what it meant for Alexander, for Vanessa, for the company, for anyone. She only knew, with growing horror, that someone, possibly several someones, had been actively working against her husband's true intentions, and that whatever Richard had been trying to protect, he had clearly believed it important enough to hide from his own longtime lawyer. She closed the folder, locked it back in the drawer, and sat in the silent study for a long time, trying to decide who, in this entire grieving, fractured family, she could actually trust enough to tell. Eleanor told no one for 4 agonizing days. She watched Alexander move through his grief with mechanical efficiency, throwing himself into funeral logistics and company transition meetings, and found she couldn't bring herself to hand him one more devastating complication before he'd even buried his father. She watched Vanessa orchestrate funeral details with unsettling composure, and found herself, for the first time, truly studying her future daughter-in-law with suspicious eyes. She thought about confronting Daniel Cross directly, but something about the folder's careful secrecy, hidden specifically from his office, made her hesitate. If Richard hadn't trusted Daniel with this, why would she? Each night, Eleanor lay awake replaying small moments from the past year that she'd dismissed at the time, Richard's increasing irritability whenever Daniel visited. His insistence, twice, on private meetings Vanessa wasn't included in. A comment, weeks before his death, that Eleanor had brushed off as simple paranoia from a tired old man. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you have to watch most carefully. She began watching Maria too, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, dawning curiosity. Richard had grown unusually fond of the young housekeeper and her son in his final year. Eleanor remembered now how often Richard had insisted Noah visit, how protective he'd grown of the boy's ridiculous, wonderful little robot, as he'd once fondly called it. She found herself wondering, with a chill she couldn't fully explain, whether that fondness had been entirely what it appeared to be. Meanwhile, Vanessa's own unease was deepening for entirely different reasons. Daniel had grown erratic, calling her late at night, anxious about loose ends, insisting they needed to finalize the will reading immediately after the funeral, before anyone has time to question anything. His desperation unsettled her. She had built her entire plan around Daniel's competence and discretion, and competence, she was beginning to realize, crumbles quickly under genuine panic. "We need this done quickly and quietly," Daniel told her the night before the funeral, his voice tight. "The moment that signature is on the paper, it's finished. No one can challenge it after that." Vanessa agreed, smoothing down her own rising anxiety with practiced calm, with no idea that the one person capable of unraveling their entire careful scheme was, at that exact moment, sound asleep down the hall, clutching a small toy robot that held the only undeniable proof of what Richard Sterling had truly wanted. Richard Sterling's funeral drew over 200 mourners. Business partners, employees, distant relatives, journalists covering the passing of a man whose name appeared regularly in financial headlines. The chapel itself was a study in restrained elegance, white lilies lining the aisle, soft string music accompanying the slow procession of guests finding their seats. Alexander sat in the front row beside his mother, his face composed into the careful, practiced neutrality of a man who had spent his entire adult life keeping emotion contained behind boardroom discipline, though Eleanor, watching him closely, could see the grief trembling just beneath the surface. Vanessa sat beside him, elegant in tailored black, occasionally resting a comforting hand on his arm for the benefit of watching guests, while exchanging brief, tense glances with Daniel Cross seated 2 rows back. The funeral service itself proceeded with somber formality, eulogies from longtime business partners, a hymn, a final viewing. What guests didn't realize was that Daniel had specifically arranged, with Vanessa's enthusiastic agreement, to conduct a brief, private, preliminary will acknowledgement immediately following the service, while emotions ran high and scrutiny ran low. Technically optional, but framed to Alexander as routine, expected, simply one more difficult thing to get through today. Maria attended as part of the household staff present to assist with the reception, Noah beside her in a small black suit and clip-on tie, solemn and unusually quiet, still clutching Captain Bolt against his chest as he had every day since Richard's death, refusing, despite Maria's gentle attempts, to leave the toy behind even for the funeral. As the service concluded and Daniel began quietly directing the immediate family toward a private side room for the brief formality, guests still filing respectfully toward the reception hall, something in Noah's small chest squeezed tight with an anxiety he didn't have words for. He had heard Vanessa's tense, urgent phone call in the garden weeks ago. He had heard the word papers, and before anyone questions anything. He didn't understand the legal weight of any of it. But he understood with a simple absolute clarity that only small children possess, that something was deeply, urgently wrong, and that the adults around him, for reasons he couldn't explain, did not seem to be stopping it. Inside the small side chapel, Daniel Cross had laid the document on a polished side table. His hand steadier now that the moment had finally arrived. "Just a formality, Alexander," he said smoothly. "Standard acknowledgement of receipt before the formal reading next week. Your father's estate requires it." Alexander, exhausted and aching with grief, barely glanced at the document before reaching for the pen Daniel offered. Vanessa stood close beside him, her expression carefully arranged into supportive solemnity, her eyes flicking briefly, anxiously toward the door. Maria, standing respectfully near the entrance with the other staff, felt Noah suddenly go rigid beside her, his small hand gripping hers with surprising force. "Mama," he whispered urgently, "that's the bad papers." "Noah, sweetheart, not now," Maria began, mortified, trying to gently steer him back. But Noah, with the fearless, unfiltered conviction that had defined him his entire short life, broke free from her hand and ran. "Don't sign the will." His scream tore through the quiet chapel as he sprinted down the aisle, Captain Bolt clutched against his chest, skidding to a stop directly in front of Alexander, breathless, tears welling in his wide eyes. "Grandpa Richard said don't let the bad lady sign anything. He said it's a secret, it's in here." He held the worn toy robot up with both hands, thrusting it toward Alexander with desperate urgency. "He said only Captain Bolt knows the real one." The room went utterly silent. Alexander's pen stopped, hovering above the paper, his entire body frozen. Vanessa's composed expression cracked, just for an instant, into something close to panic. Daniel Cross's face had gone pale. Eleanor, standing in the doorway, felt every fragmented piece of the past week, the locked drawer, the folder, the strange late-night conversations, suddenly slam into place with horrifying clarity. "Alexander," she said quietly, stepping forward, her voice trembling but certain, "don't sign anything. Not yet." It was Eleanor who finally took the toy robot gently from Noah's hands, kneeling to his height, her voice soft despite the storm breaking around them. "Sweetheart, did Grandpa Richard tell you there was something special inside Captain Bolt?" Noah nodded solemnly. "He said push his tummy hard. He said it's a secret message. He made me promise not to tell unless the bad papers came out." With trembling hands, Eleanor pressed firmly on the toy's chest panel. A small seam along its back clicked open, revealing a tiny recorder nestled inside, exactly where the electronic specialist had installed it 6 weeks earlier, at Richard's careful, deliberate instruction. She pressed play. Richard Sterling's voice, weakened but unmistakably clear, filled the silent chapel. "If you're hearing this, then someone tried to push through the old will before the truth could come out. I want my family to hear this directly from me, not through lawyers, not through paperwork that can be twisted. 2 months ago, I changed my will through an independent firm, specifically because I discovered Daniel Cross and Vanessa Hart had been quietly working together to control my estate before I'd even passed. I have proof, documented conversations, financial records, held securely with my new attorneys. My true wishes are simple. Alexander inherits full control of Sterling Holdings, as always intended. My wife Eleanor is fully provided for, as always intended. And because 2 people in this house showed me more genuine kindness in my final year than anyone with my last name managed to. Maria Lopez and her son Noah will receive a trust ensuring their security and education for the rest of their lives. Everything else remains as originally planned. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you all this directly. I didn't know who I could trust in the room. I trusted a 4-year-old instead. He never once let me down. The recording clicked off. The silence afterward was absolute. Vanessa's carefully maintained composure shattered completely. This is clearly some kind of manipulation, Alexander. You can't possibly believe. Sit down, Vanessa, Alexander said. His voice quiet, deadly calm, the document in his hand now trembling for an entirely different reason. He turned to Daniel Cross, whose face had gone the color of ash. Get my father's actual attorneys on the phone. Now. The conspiracy 3 people had spent nearly a year carefully constructing collapsed in the span of 90 seconds, exposed entirely by a toy robot, a recording device, and a 4-year-old who had simply done exactly what he'd promised. The hours following the funeral dissolved into controlled chaos. Alexander's legal team confirmed within the day that Richard's amended will was fully valid, properly witnessed and notarized by the independent firm he'd quietly engaged. Daniel Cross, confronted with the recording and the subsequent financial audit Alexander ordered immediately, did not even attempt to maintain his denial for long. Documentation of his communications with Vanessa, recovered from his own office files once the company's legal team gained access, made any further deception pointless. He was terminated immediately and referred for criminal investigation regarding attempted estate fraud. Vanessa's collapse was faster and more public. By the time she returned to the estate that evening to collect her belongings, news of the chapel confrontation had already reached several of the journalists who'd attended the funeral. Her engagement ring, left on the entryway table without a word, was the last anyone at Sterling Holdings ever saw of her. Alexander sat with his mother long into that night, the two of them finally speaking openly about Richard in a way grief and busyness had prevented for weeks. Eleanor wept, for her husband's loneliness in his final months, for the betrayal he'd quietly carried without burdening his family, for his strange, brilliant decision to trust a small child when he trusted almost no adult around him. He always said Noah reminded him of you at that age, Eleanor told her son softly. Before the world taught you to guard everything so carefully. Maria, meanwhile, sat in stunned disbelief in her small staff cottage, Noah finally asleep beside her after the most overwhelming day of his short life, Captain Bolt, emptied of its secret now, still tucked safely under his arm. She hadn't fully processed what Richard's recorded words meant for her and Noah's future. She only knew, with overwhelming gratitude, that the kind old man who'd enjoyed her son's company had been protecting them in ways she never imagined, right up until his final weeks. Alexander appeared at her door the following morning, exhausted. His usual composure replaced by something rawer and more genuine than Maria had ever seen from him. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. And I owe your son a great deal more than that. Maria, overwhelmed, simply nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Neither of them yet knew how much that single, humbling conversation would come to mean to both of them in the months ahead. In the months that followed, Sterling Holdings underwent changes far beyond its leadership. Alexander, shaken by how close he'd come to losing his father's true legacy, and how thoroughly he'd been deceived by someone he trusted completely, began making deliberate changes to how he lived, not just how he worked. He started taking actual vacation days. He began having dinner with his mother weekly, without his phone at the table. He found himself more and more often drawn to the quiet warmth of the staff cottage where Maria and Noah lived, initially out of gratitude, then increasingly because their company had become the genuine highlight of his exhausting weeks. Maria's trust, established exactly as Richard intended, secured Noah's education and their family's long-term stability, though Maria, true to her fierce independence, insisted on continuing her work at the estate for nearly a year afterward, unwilling to accept the change too quickly or too easily. Alexander, understanding her pride better than she expected, never pushed. Noah, blissfully unaware of trusts and inheritances, simply enjoyed that Mr. Alexander started showing up more often, eventually teaching him to fish in the estate's pond and patiently answering his endless, fearless questions about everything from sharks to stock markets, which Noah found equally fascinating. Eleanor watched the slow, careful warming between her son and Maria with quiet satisfaction, never pushing, simply grateful to see Alexander laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. A full year after Richard's death, Alexander finally worked up the courage to ask Maria to dinner, not as employer to employee, but simply as himself. She said yes, nervous and unsure. Two people who had both spent years building careful walls slowly, deliberately choosing to lower them for each other. Daniel Cross's legal proceedings concluded with a lengthy sentence for fraud. Vanessa, her reputation thoroughly destroyed within their social circle, relocated quietly to another city, attempting, unsuccessfully by most accounts, to rebuild a version of the life she'd nearly stolen. Sterling Holdings, under Alexander's continued leadership, thrived, guided now by a man who finally understood, thanks to his father's final, extraordinary act of trust, that the people worth keeping close were rarely the ones who made themselves the easiest to love. 18 months after the funeral, while finally clearing out the last of Richard's private study, Eleanor discovered a second, smaller envelope tucked behind a framed photograph on his desk, one she had somehow missed during her earlier search. Inside was a single handwritten letter, dated the same day Richard had given Noah the toy robot. Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means the recording did its job and the truth came out the way I hoped. There's one more thing I never told anyone, including Alexander. Maria's mother worked as a housekeeper for my own parents, decades ago, back when I was a young man learning this business. She showed me more genuine kindness during a difficult year of my life than almost anyone in my own family did at the time. I never forgot her. When Maria came to work for us and I realized who her mother had been, I felt it was no accident, more like a debt finally finding its way back around. I didn't tell her because I didn't want her kindness toward me to ever feel like an obligation. I just wanted to make sure that this time, the kindness didn't go unanswered. Take care of them, Eleanor. All of them. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time, tears falling freely, understanding at last that her husband's quiet fondness for Maria and Noah had never been simple sentiment. It had been gratitude, patiently waiting 40 years to be repaid. This story reminds us that the people who quietly show up for us, without asking for recognition, without expecting anything in return, are very often the ones who matter most, even when the world is too busy or too distracted to notice them. Richard Sterling had every resource imaginable to protect his final wishes. He had lawyers, executives, a family name that opened any door. And yet, in the end, he placed his trust in the one person in that entire house incapable of being bought, manipulated, or intimidated. A 4-year-old boy whose only agenda was keeping a promise to someone who had been kind to him. There is something profoundly important in that choice. Sincerity, the story tells us, is rarer and more valuable than sophistication. Loyalty built on genuine care will always outlast loyalty built on what someone can gain. And perhaps most importantly, kindness is never wasted, even when it seems to go unnoticed for years, even decades. It has a way of finding its way back around, exactly when it's needed most. Now I want to hear from you. Which moment hit you hardest? Noah's scream in the chapel, or Richard's final letter to Eleanor at the very end? If you were Maria, would you have believed Richard's kindness was simple sentiment, or would you have suspected there was something more behind it? And be honest. Did you guess the twist with a toy robot before the recording played, or did it completely catch you off guard? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I always love hearing which part touched you the most. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next emotional journey. And if someone in your life needs a reminder that kindness always finds its way back, share this with them today. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.